There are many, many issues that arise out of this very small text. I don't know if we'll get to all of them. I'm going to just raise some of the, what I think as major themes that emerge from here, and then hopefully we can open the floor and tie together some of the strands that have emerged from our discussions today. I wanted to begin by introducing the dramatis personae here, each one of whom I think is a unique person of the early modern period in a certain way. Ber Perlhefter, who adopted his wife's family name after their marriage, which was not such an uncommon practice as the New York Times today might allow you to think, was born in Eastern Europe to a rabbinic family, became an itinerant rabbi, not Baal Shem, and is famous for being the second Sabbatai Magid to go out of the home of Avraham Rovigo. There's a wonderful article about his Sabbatai theology by Avraham El-Kayam in one of the earliest volumes of Kabbalah. He's a very interesting person. In addition to being a Sabbatai Magid in that circle, he was also one of those who supported the initial claim of Mordechai Mochiach of Eisenstadt, who was another messianic claimant. Eventually he saw that this person was a fraud and he recanted. And he is the author of several different types of handbooks, books that were written, a book of Shechita, written just to be able to sell it. I presume it doesn't have much in it that I think is interesting. His interesting work is in Manuscript. He published several smaller things. That's Ber. Ber comes to our attention because he was living at the time that these letters were written in the city of Altdorf. Now, Altdorf had no Jews and no Jewish community in the late 17th century. But Ber and a circle of other Jews and former Jews were living in the home of a famous Christian Hebraist, and that's the second figure here, Johann Christoph Wagenseil, who was one of the eminent Christian Hebraists of this period. And Christian Hebraism, something we didn't really touch on so far, is really an early modern creature. I don't think it existed before or after, sometime between, let's say, the late 15th in Italy century and maybe the late 18th, early 19th. He is not a Philo-Semite. Christian Hebraism is not the same as Philo-Semitism. And one of the fascinating things about Wagenseil, who obsessively collected Jewish texts, who was a very competent Hebraist, who knew his rabbinics and translated various tractates into Latin, Wagenseil collected, and this was his particular obsession, Tela Ignia Satanae, the fiery darts of Satan. He collected not only works of Jewish jurisprudence, not only samples of Jewish epistolary, for instance, which is where this particular correspondence is preserved. It's an example to him, just like tombstone inscriptions, which come in the same manuscript. He just collected everything. He wanted to teach and learn everything there was to know about Jewish texts and letters. But one of the things that obsessed him were Jewish anti-Christian texts. Okay, he was one of the first to publish Toldot Yeshu. There's only one other early modern printing one other edition, actually, of a completely different manuscript, and several others. He published Mulhausen's Nitzachon. He was interested in showing, and this is one of the things I want to kind of bring out from here. This is a period in which new bridges are being built between certain Christians and certain Jews. New opportunities are opening, but they're not neutral spaces. And despite these bridges, there are still chasms. There are still differences. And what I'm hearing today in the search for, what's still not printed, the new in this period, what makes you a Jew? What is there left for Jewish identity when Jewish texts, rabbinic texts, when nothing is unique, sacred, it's all open, it's all out there. We didn't mention this, and again, this is just my theory, and this is not my field, Kabbalah, but there's also a sense here that the Christians have already mastered some of the basic texts. The Bible is an area of contention. By this point, the Talmud has already been appropriated by Christians. And yes, there is something called Christian Kabbalah, but there's a very strong sense in some of these Kabbalistic texts that this is what provides the uniqueness of Jews and Judaism. So that was a little digression. That's not part of my text. And the third person, who is Ber Perlhefter, who was a correspondent of Wagenseil's, and this is a correspondence that sometimes is addressed directly to her husband and sometimes to Wagenseil, but making reference to her husband. Bella is somebody we would never have known about had Wagenseil not had this obsession about collecting Jewish texts. She was a native of Prague, came probably from a higher social rank than her husband. Her father was one of the pillars of the Jewish community in Prague. They had probably migrated after the expulsion of Jews from Vienna to Prague. And she's very learned for a woman of her age. She even refers in one of these letters, once we look at the text, to writing letters on behalf of other women. She was a kind of scrivener. People came to her to write. And that brings me to the first issue in the text itself, which is the highly artificial, constructed form of these letters. Epistolary is so formulaic, and especially somebody who's accustomed to writing for others probably had model books in front of her. So where do you draw out the voice? This is, again, a woman's voice, so a precious voice, a voice that's pretty difficult to recover in first person, but it's not the raw voice, it's a mediated voice. It's a voice mediated by what she expected. There are certain constructions when you come to write, even today, dear John, you don't mean dear. Yes, well, every single word, sometimes we're parsing every single word, but so much of this is formulaic. So how do you know how to read the text? That's something, I have no pat answer to this, just something we need to be aware. It's not an autobiography, but it is a first person voice in some form. That's something that I think is another, it's not unique to the early modern period, but it's certainly the subjectivity, the sense that the I has something to say and to contribute to the discourse. That's something that it appears to me becomes stronger, at least in this period. Okay, some of the other things I want to talk about in general. What are the boundaries then between Jews and Christians? Ber is living in Wagenseil's household, separated from his family. Wagenseil, who is paying a stipend, and that's probably the reason that Ber is there, he doesn't have any other obvious sources of income. invites Bella to come too. And if you look at the bottom of page 1 in my texts, it is my husband, my master, who lives with my Lord in his quarters. I'm reading from the second to the bottom line on page 1 of the English text, who wrote me last week, the bottom line, how my Lord desires, that's Wagenseil, that I come to join my husband in Altdorf on a particular day, Tuesday, the 13th of Kislev, which is the 12th of December in 1674, to join his celebration and to attend the party that he's arranging for the gentlemen who come before him. I think it's a Christmas party. What else could it be towards this week in December? Wagenseil, by the way, is very into his correspondence, writing to him in Hebrew. They address him in the honorifics, if you look at the Hebrew original, that you would address a Torah sage, and they play on his name. They call him Avot Ha'agalah, Wagenseil. So Adoni Moriv Rabbi Avot Ha'agalah. It's very strange, and this is clear again. To me, it seems like almost an obsession of Wagenseil's to kind of live into Jewish experiences and texts. And this is not unusual. There's a Christian Hebraist I came across in some other small German town who asked that a synagogue be constructed in his castle, complete with a Torah scroll and all the other decorations, because he wanted to show the students what it was like. So what are the boundaries? Why is Bella resists? She says, I can't come now. It's the winter time. It's not safe to travel. This may not be an excuse. She has a small child who she writes about. Bella ultimately bore 7 children, and none of them lived past childhood. And this was the great sorrow of her life. And towards the end of their life, she asks her husband, Ber, to write a manuscript as a memorial to their children. And this work has remained in manuscript. It's Ber Sheva. Each chapter is named after a different child. And that's another thing we could digress into if we wanted to, that the new way of constructing memorials. The literature of consolation that changes, the need for consolation for such a thing. That manuscript it was never printed, but was copied many, many times. And in some of the dedications, in some of the copies of the manuscript, it says that it's being given to parents who have lost children, so that it should be a consolation to them as it was for the original owners. Bella is in the middle of constructing, or transacting, I should say, a business deal. She says, yesterday, right in the middle of that paragraph, yesterday I sent you veal, tender and good, 15.5 liter, German, 15.5 pfund. She gives the price 3 kreuzer, and she uses the Yiddish term salemer. Now, it is not unusual to use a different word, a Jewish word, for a coin. Florins are sometimes referred to as prachim, weiße Münzen, white silver coins are sometimes referred to as levanim. But salemer instead of... Okay, again, it's not unusual, but it seems to me that we could at least use this as an excuse to discuss dysphemism, words of opprobrium that Jews commonly used when referring to anything that had to do with Christian sancta. And these were prevalent through our period, not just texts, but in everyday speech, and Christians remark upon this and notice this. And again, some of them collect these. How many different ways Jews refer to a church in disparaging terms? 25 different ways that Jews will refer to a church, and some of these are still in circulation. This is not an invention. So here's a little, to me, this symbolizes the built-in cunning of popular Jewish culture that somehow is conducting a polemic, a restraint, building a wall against the world outside, which is becoming increasingly accessible, and which is making, on certain levels, overtures to Jews.
But she's also...
Again, I don't know if this alone can bear that argument, but you can look at other texts.
It can do that, but also something that sounds like the opposite. She's also teasing him, and she's giving him something. If she knows that he gets a kind of frisson from having an inside access to this sort of thing. She's also being a good businesswoman. She's dealing with the client here. She's sending him the bill and giving him what he wants. So
she doesn't give him what he wants. What he wants is to convert them, bottom line. He has several Meshumadim living with them, and they refer to Ber as Dov Asher Lo Tov. And Tov would be his ultimate conversion. He's being stubborn about it. And one of the reasons he's being stubborn about it, maybe, is because he's a Sabbatai. He knows who the real Messiah is, and he doesn't need Christianity. Elliot?
You suggested the possibility of an esoteric reading of the letters. I wouldn't say so much esoteric as perhaps in some places tongue-in-cheek.
I don't say esoteric.
One of the other letters, I've just looked at the Hebrew, 22, the letter number, let's see how letter number 4 in the Hebrew, page 22, of the Hebrew, or page 339 of the Hebrew Imagination. You may have it in Hebrew, where she says, we're part of our explanation to Wagenseil about not being able to is he ain't Sha'ela Lebanim.
Yes.
My sense is that if she were writing to her own husband, she wouldn't say that.
I agree with you.
Big.
I agree with you.
And it's sort of, I'm trying to imagine the look on her face as she's writing that line.
I agree with you. I also noticed that she answers only 2 days before the intended party is supposed to take place. Her response probably got there after the party took place. That's one way of ensuring that the person can't get back to you and importune you any further. I think she didn't want to come.
So if there's any room for speaking about something we haven't spoken about yet, maybe subaltern studies in Judaism and weapons of the weak and things of that sort, I think that this might be a place to think about. As it places in the text where on the one hand she is using the voice that the master wants her to use, but yet finding ways of serving some sort of distance against it.
Thank you. Do you want to ask
something? I'm talking about the distance actually, because of that date, but also when she's talking about the money, she said, I received the payment and I sent you. So I was wondering whether actually they were relatively close, that a trip was possible during one day. I don't know whether you can, especially if you send the deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that.
It's December though, it could be frozen.
That's true. Why would someone ask for veal, which is an agricultural product that is raised in every farm? Why would somebody ask for it from distance?
Apparently this might have been, milk-fed, do I know, some commodity that's, some commodity that was hard to get in Altdorf.
in two ways. That either she received the money and therefore that very day she sent the bill.
Yes.
Or she writes, I sent you bill, tender book, da 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 da. And indeed, yesterday I received the payments for the above mentioned bill. So it could be that it all happened in a day. So maybe
Well, I want to pick up on your comment about the distance, without talking so much here about the technical distance between Schneitach, where she was living, where there was a Jewish community, and Altdorf, where her husband was living, where there wasn't. And therefore, I don't know if she's sending kosher, I don't know what she's sending, but what's clear here is something much larger. Families are living separated. This is common for Jewish families, for husbands to be away for long periods of time, for letters essentially to kind of live the life and have the conversations that they cannot have in real life. Without saying, this is true of the medieval period too.
It's not necessarily Jewish. In Lawrence Stone's book on the family, he tries to talk about women who are on the farm, running the farm, while the husband is in the city for lengthy periods carrying on business. This would only reinforce the early modernity or modernity.
Right. But this might take us back to another layer, which is her family is a family of exiles, and even though she feels drawn back to Prague, I guess because of family and amenities, neither of them are living in a continuous place for long periods of time. And that, I think, this disruption, this alienation, this constant mobility, this sense that we're on the move, and therefore the necessity of building an alternative structure. There's a supra-communal network here that takes the place of that firmly embedded, geographically fixed community. And this brings me to the larger question of the identity of what is Ashkenaz in this period. This is something that has come up. There's a wonderful article by Joseph Davis about Ashkenaz and the circulation of the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century. If the historical experience is different, let's say, in Poland than in Prague, than in Western Europe, than in the South, in Italy, in the Mediterranean, there are still all kinds of links. Travelers are one. There's so much mobility. There are students who are traveling. There are family members who are going. How do we characterize the Jewish community if it isn't always the people who are granted these privileges to reside in a particular place, but it's people who are constantly moving. They're in one place for a few years, they're in another place for a few years. And what does this mean for tradition and identity and continuity in this period? That was another issue that I thought arose from the distances here. Moshe?
Well, part of it is also your family is far flung.
Yeah.
The memoir of Asher Levi, I think, is very striking in that everywhere he goes, there are relatives over a very wide geographical area, so that you have, it's not just a question of a greater community. You have anchors, you have anchor points, let's say.
But that is a kind of meta-community, if you will. It's an alternative community. Community may not be only the one that you have legal rights to reside in. Right. Your community is that larger, far-flung network.
It goes through the family connection.
Yes, yes, kinship ties are very important. I wouldn't disagree. Yes.
May I ask, I read now that
again, these letters, it seems to me that what's missing here that might make it early modern is some personal feelings. This, she's writing to her husband. No personal feelings at all that I can see. I mean, she asks him, come home.
Personally, I think there's a lot of personal feeling. I think there's anger here. She says to
I
him,
am wrong. Just a second, let me...
she says to him,
She says in the last letter,
yes,
just a second, she asked him to come home because there is some, I translated, their business ASIC or whatever. Come home, there is something interesting, you know, ASIC, which might be a lot of things.
she tries to draw him home. One of the things she says,
But not saying,
she says if
I
you,
miss you, or
She
you miss me, or even letters from the Judaism are better than this one. Really, I'm telling you, a lot of personal feelings.
but maybe personal feelings are not necessarily sentimental feelings. I think that she is angry with her husband for leaving her alone, and she says in one of these letters, if you came and saw your daughter, you would not recognize her. That's, when somebody's angry, they don't necessarily say, I miss you. They say, you ought to come home now. This is your obligation, your duty, your family, and you're gone.
Saying somebody that this is your obligation, this is not that personal. I mean, that's my feeling when me.
I agree with you. I think I think this is not a love letter. And it's consciously not a love letter. She is not saying, darling, I miss you so much.
Also, that Wagenseil was reading her correspondence.
Not only is he reading it, that's where we have it. We have this letter from Wagenseil's collection. So she knows, perhaps, that anything she writes is going to end up in his, archive, and she might not want to reveal her true heart. I think that it's very, as you say, formulaic and businesslike, and again, to my reading, there's resentment and anger here, not so much love and longing, and that's perfectly fine.
Is it because of language? She's writing it in Hebrew. I was wondering why she was writing it. I mean, to Wagenseil, I understand why she's writing in Hebrew. But why to her husband she is writing in Hebrew? And I wonder.
I think she's copying some of the formula from a book, from a manual.
That the fact that it's not the language that she would express herself in, so it may sound very stiff and businesslike because she's writing.
Again, the fact that it's not written in Yiddish means that she considers herself a professional writer. This is what she does. I don't know if she does it for a living, but she does it and she's respected for it. And in this society, this flowery, dry, constructed language was what was admired.
Abraham and Sarah, when I was reading it, whether he was trying to show off his wife, how learned she is, and perhaps asked her to write in Hebrew.
Interesting. Or whether there wasn't some arrangement where she was supposed to write her.
She was part of the package.
Again, I'm extrapolating from Italy. In the 16th century, a man would customarily be both a professional letter writer, a teacher, and dancing teacher. That's say those Jewish Renaissance figures, bankers who hired an all-purpose melamed to be in their home. That melamed would sometimes teach dancing as well. And my sense is that she is a 17th century female woman, and that
which there were many male musicians, Jews in Prague. So being a member of an upper-class family, she may have had her own private instruction in this.
So I think that she, in other words, it's not an accident that she's skilled both in letter writing and dance.
Interesting.
In 16th century, the two allied skills for teachers.
Actually, it's even more common than that. I have some texts of somebody hiring somebody to teach them how to sing a certain number of songs so that they can sing at their wedding. And it's almost becomes, you know, if you're ready, you have to sing, you have to dance, and it must have been very...
It's certainly that governance would have been better.
Motion?
Do you know how she obtained her education?
No.
Can I return to the question of Hebraism as the early modern phenomenon?
As an, not the.
An early modern phenomenon, and how it influenced Jewish culture.
Mm-hmm.
It strikes me as a Western European early modern phenomenon.
Well, it comes up to Germany from Italy. We can trace.
Poland is clearly not part of it. There is no Christian Hebraism. If there is, it's really only trenches, and it's very short. In the 16th century, they all become Protestants afterwards. And then you have a few individuals in the north where the Protestants are, but it really is not significant. So we don't have that. When I'm asking then, the boundaries, so to speak, remain, because Christians don't have aspects. Jewish books are not open to Polish Christians, Catholics, mostly Catholics. There. So I guess the question would be, how does the early modern period, so it would be more medieval, Poland would be more medieval in some ways if Hebraism is early modern. But that's a larger question. How is it then reflected in the early modern Jewish culture in Eastern Europe? If, as you say, there is this influence of how they are trying to deal with dealing with this opening up of those Jewish texts in the West, Jews, that is. So to Eastern Europeanists, how would it make early modern different in fact in Eastern Europe?
I can't answer to Eastern Europeanists, not being one, but I am wondering whether the ultimate breaking down of certain barriers in the West that leads to emancipation don't have their roots in this greater openness, even if it comes out of a not necessarily philo-Semitic tradition. It ultimately breaks down some of the sense that Jewish religion is opaque, impenetrable, unknowable. Once it's known, it can be controlled, conquered. Again, there's no way to quantify or certify this. In Poland, that doesn't happen in the same way. I think the otherness remains stronger because there's no tradition anywhere in any part of the Christian church. And it is in the church that there is some Hebraism among Catholics, and there is no Protestant tradition of it. So there is nowhere for this to come out.
But I wonder, we were talking about this sort of breakdown of the Ashkenaz, whether that culture also can play with the idea of the reaction to Hebraism in the West and the lack thereof in the East, in the sort of separation between Pauline and Ashkenaz. I don't know.
I think one can, that's one of the things that you could point to and say, look, it's not the same, and therefore, you can't use the term for everything, but for specific things.
Well, one of the things you can compare is the Ashkenazic diaspora. You talk in early modern, you talk about the Iberian diaspora, but nobody really spends as much time thinking about the Ashkenazic diaspora and the parallels to speaking Ladino in the Ottoman Empire and speaking German in Poland. In other words, a social cultural shift, and then the consciousness of being Ashkenazic in Poland, being Sephardic in the Ottoman Empire, are very parallel, and the contacts of these communities represent contact studies and frontier studies of the New World as well. I mean, the 16th, 17th century is the time of cultures intersecting with each other and becoming self-conscious in new ways. And the Ashkenazim in northern Italy and in Poland represent a parallel structure to the Iberian diasporas that we talk about all the time as part of this period. So I think that part of it, the social shift, is that the immigration and resettlement and confrontation with native populations is parallel and part of the early modern for both subcultures.
Just for the record, this is something that Israel Martel occasionally addresses. I've heard it speak on this.
Yeah, I think it needs to be talked about more.
Okay, I'll draw your attention to another line. What do we still have time? Okay, towards the bottom of page 5 in the English translation, about 3/4 of the way down, there's a report, and this is a letter from Bella to her husband Ber, a letter which does end up in the Wagenseil archive, in which Bella reports, towards the bottom of page 5, that there was a quarrel. She's reporting news, even though she's not living in Prague, but she is kept up on the news. She says there was a fight between the leaders of the Jewish community, and one of the apostates denounced them, saying that Simcha Winiberg, the apostate who was killed here in Prague in 1666, that the Jewish community had bribed a Gentile to kill him. And an entire alilah resulted from this. I don't know, again, what actually happened to Simcha Winiberg, other than in Prague, the Jesuits made a tremendous martyr out of him. Look, they said, the Jews are doing to this convert what they did to Jesus. They've killed him because he converted. And ultimately, the person who had been supposedly hired to do this said, "You are falsely blaming the Jews. They didn't ask me to kill him, and I didn't kill him. Who knows who the real killer is?" Therefore, the ministers, Yarum Hodam, this is only because of laziness, sent to the Kaiser, Yarum Hodot, and I heard from reliable sources that an order came from the Kaiser that the local ministers should release the Jews, since the Gentile falsifies and the apostate denounces, and an apostate is not trustworthy. I thought that was significant here. The apostate becomes the locus of some of the tension between the Jews and the Christians. And this is a very, she's reporting this to Ber, who's living in a home where there are apostates who are trying to turn him into one of them. So again, there's so many levels of text here. What is she saying to him in this line? What is this saying again about the boundaries, about what's permissible to say? It's permissible to say worse things about apostates than it is about Christians.
There's a text that, if I remember correctly, was published in the Rosenium and Israel. It's about a case in Venice, a family that converts. And the son converts, I believe he was a doctor, I'm not sure, but his mother is brought along with, and then she is accused of going back together to buy kosher food because she won't eat what the kid is giving her, even though she's now Christian. And when they go to church, she will regularly make a vulgar sign with her hand towards the Madonna and suggest that the Virgin is, after all, a whore and had children out of wedlock and so on.
Shocking.
She is sentenced to eternal incarceration in her son's house. She'll never be let out of her room. And they feed her through a slit and so forth. It's clear she's mad. I mean, it's fairly clear, or at least it would appear that she's simply a crazy old lady because she doesn't understand.
Or is it possible that her son offered her? Do you know that you can offer relatives for conversion in Italy?
Once the conversion happened, her continual public behavior.
In other words, she may not have acquiesced really ever.
It's quite possible. But in any case, having said that, one of the things that comes up in the text, which I guess in a sense is a really good early modern text, one of the things that comes up in the text is a discussion. They go to the ghetto to ask about whether she comes to buy food and things like that. And people comment to the investigators about the Son converted, and this is exactly the line they used. That is, it was standard to say, if they weren't good Jews, they're no good as Christians. This was a standard thing. And I'm not sure that, I appreciate the valence you're putting on it in the way you're talking. It's certainly not politically correct to talk about people's new identities in this way, and so forth and so on. It's probably a kind of rhetoric that was more acceptable in this period because it was. In other words, we see it and say, my God, how could you say that a convert to Christianity is not to be believed? But what they're really saying is, come on, these people who flip-flop on their faith, who could know what they really think? I think it's something of a standard rhetorical device.
Elliot?
Yes. On a matter of rhetoric, I think that this very learned woman who also has a very good sense of irony. For example, when she said, I think here she is, in a very subtle way, quoting a Talmudic passage and also using it in the context of her letter. That is to say, when she says, Meshumad eino ne'aman, which is a halachic formulation. A matter of, I cannot go to a butcher's shop owned by an apostate and buy not kosher meat from him because he's not to be believed. So that she's cleverly using the halachic formulation, and therefore saying something about Meshumad, but yet also simply quoting the sources. And as long as she's quoting the sources, she's not crossing the line.
If I can just add to that, it doesn't say Meshumad malshin, Meshumad eino, it says Meshumad hamalshin. And so in some ways she's not implicating him. She's saying the one who ratted on us. Yeah. She's not, there's, I think there's more play there than she's not really coming out and saying quite as bluntly.
Well, and just to respond, my guess here, and it's only what my ear is telling me, is that this sounds, Yossi, of course, is very practiced here, and he's thinking that it sounds like there's an allusion to some text. It sounds like there's some text to which it alludes and it's paraphrased, and I would look for that.
Okay, it's, again, this one archive, the Wagenseil archive, which I came upon almost 20 years ago. First, I was interested in Ber Perlhefter for my first book because he was a Sabbatai, and then it took, at that time Leipzig was still part of East Germany, and getting a microfilm of that correspondence required really extraordinary effort. And I finally did get it from them, only because my great-grandfather had once served as a rabbi in Leipzig, I think. And that somehow seemed to have moved the curators to grant my request. I then revisited the letters to look at Wagenseil because I was interested in Christian Hebraists. And it's only recently that I looked back at this and I said, look what else is here that I missed reading the first time around. So this is true, I think, for all of our texts. We look for different things at different times, both in terms of our professional, when we look at what is outstanding about the early modern, I think it shifts from generation to generation, and even within our own work from sort of subject to subject. It's a very rich and layered set of texts, and I think I want to end with that. Again, the sense of bridges being constructed out at the same time as walls are still being built, and this is true both in the literal and metaphorical sense in this period.
That's a beautiful way to conclude.